Hey, I want to give all the subscribers and folks that watch these videos an update onto what's been going on here. So this is a very rough outline for the next video. I'm going to run through it just so you have an idea of what to expect, something to look forward to. In short, this is going to be a critique response to Oliver Stone's Ukraine on Fire, but it's also going to just in general, I think, elaborate and explore some things that are left out of both mainstream media as well as social media, especially left-leaning social media discussions. So not necessarily challenging narratives, but trying to provide context, point out flaws with some of the information, as well as diving into areas that were just left unexplored. My thesis for the actual movie is that it's essentially just propaganda, and that while there are things that are just flatly incorrect in it, its major problem is essentially lies by omission. So it's just leaving so much out. And I think most people could understand that when you look at who's being interviewed, but more importantly, who is not being interviewed. However, I think that maybe some of that is overlooked in sometimes a good faith, sometimes a bad faith want to critique the West. So getting into the video that I'll be making, there'll be an introduction and I'll explain more, elaborate on essentially what I just said now. I'm going to describe some of the imagery. There's a lot of mashups and montages in the beginning, and there's a purpose to that. I think that's fairly obvious, that he's trying to beat into the viewer's brain or make a direct connection between World War II and the Maidan protests of 2014. There's a long history of anti-Semitism in the region, which is not discussed. And I think that that's necessary to have an understanding of the broader context, the true history, etc. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the Pale settlements in the area and pogroms that happened. The Ukrainian famine isn't discussed, so I'll talk about that too. Again, these things are left out, I think, strategically, because it would go against a false narrative that this movie, which is not a documentary, it's a movie, it's entertainment, but it's trying to present itself as a documentary. So it's just leaving things out that contradict the fictional narrative. I talk about an independent Ukraine that existed. That's left out of the story. And then what happened after Soviet occupation, kind of going up to the famine above it. I'll go into what happened in World War II, because that's elaborated on greatly with collaboration between some Ukrainian nationalists with Germany. So why did that happen? What did that really look like in the broader Ukrainian nationalist population? What happened before World War II with World War I and Austro-Hungary and Germany in World War I, and even prior to that, to put context around something that's hyper-focused. And of course, it's hyper-focused for propaganda reasons. I'll talk about Khrushchev. It talks about how Ukraine, or how Crimea was a gift given to Ukraine, which is not exactly true. There are a lot of narratives that can be built into that. But one of the things that was not discussed, again, was the Tatar cleansing and ethnic Russian repopulation of the area before incorporating it into Ukraine, and maybe why that happened. We'll look at Russian language. That was a hot topic. It's something that Russian propaganda likes to focus on. It completely leaves out some history involving Ukraine and Russian language prior to changes that were made. Briefly talking about this idea of polarity with Alexander Dugin, and there's a whole video with National Bolshevism y'all can watch for that. But just talking about how the whole narrative, whether it's polarity or whether it's just Stone's kind of boomer Cold War approach to this, but how it just fundamentally disenfranchises and excludes the actual Ukrainian people participating in it. It's ironically, a lot of these alt imperialists will demonize and monsterize people in other countries who go against their narrative, and then kind of rebuild a framing that is extremely Western in perspective, even when it's critiquing the West. It's, I liken it to Vietnam and how maybe like Fog of War with Robert McNamara, that documentary where he talks about how the West fundamentally misunderstood what was happening, and that had nothing, Vietnam had nothing to do with the Cold War, had nothing to do with the Soviet Union. For the Vietnamese people, the United States was just another occupying force. And of course, when you learn about Vietnamese history and you look at Imperial Japan before that, and of course, the long history of French colonialism, you start to understand how when you view things through a Western lens, sometimes in a geopolitical sense, you essentially erase the voice of the actual people that are living in that region. And that happens often with Ukraine. So that's interesting. A critical eye to the president of Ukraine that was actually there during Maidan, who was elected in 2010. It's crazy. Stone actually, I mean, I laughed. The first people that Stone interviews is Vladimir Putin, and then the president that was deposed. It's just, so blatantly ridiculous in terms of bias. But what Stone doesn't do is have a critical eye towards him. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to delve into who is this guy, right? And what are, some flaws with him. We'll talk about his opponent, Yulia, who was imprisoned. She's briefly mentioned in the Stone video. Her trial is briefly mentioned, but in reality, it was one of the core components to why that EU agreement didn't inch closer to getting done. And we'll look at that. We'll look at the European Association Agreement in context to looking at the then president of Ukraine. We'll look at some of these things I have more bulleted for me, like the family. It was part of a corrupt organization that he had built up within Ukraine that actually involved oil, and gas, I should say. So natural gas pipelines, natural gas transit from Russia to Europe is key to much of this. And a lot of the sticking points within, not really even the association agreement yet, but looking towards actually maybe entering into the EU, have to do with anti-corruption and clarity of trade. So, these are all things that are going to negatively impact the family. We'll talk about corruption, of course, the political prisoners going back up to Yulia, campaign promises and how essentially they were not just forgotten, but reversed. We'll look at how Russia applied pressure. Putin during this time, or at least some of it, was prime minister. I mean, Putin's been in power for decades. But during this time, it's interesting as he transitions back and forth within his own structure in Russia to maintain his own power. We look at how he applies power to Ukraine during this time, or pressure to Ukraine. We'll look at Yanukovych's errors. We'll look at some words from the Russian envoy, kind of events surrounding exactly what, long story short, what happened in the transition during Maidan. Of course, in Stone's narrative, it's all just a coup. It gets really kind of ridiculous and conspiratorial near the end. But instead of just blatantly saying, no, that's not what happened, I'm going to delve into the actual parliamentary procedures that occurred, look at the parties who voted and why and how they voted, not why, but how they voted. We'll look at the people who won, maybe with an eye towards Svoboda and Right Sector, because they're brought up a lot, and they had negligible seats in 2014, and then for the Right Sector. In the next election, they won no national seats. So, we'll kind of look at that and juxtaposition to this narrative that's being built. And then what we'll also do is juxtapose that to events in Belarus during the same time. and show kind of what the blueprint for Russia is. Not really even critiquing Russia, but I mean, just, I guess, objectively showing what Russia is doing. And I laugh because it's not, you don't need to be pro-US or pro-EU or pro-NATO or pro anything to just want an objective, honest take on this stuff. And, so that's kind of where I'm coming from, and Belarus is a good example for that. We'll look at NGOs, because that was a big thing. When it gets a little silly in Oliver Stone's movie, where he talks about US NGOs, and he portrays basically social media as like this nefarious agent that like undermines population and support. They're just social media campaigns. I mean, but anyway, so we'll look at the Russian NGOs that were in the area, especially in Crimea, because he doesn't do that. He only talks about the US ones, of course. He doesn't, there's no balance in his movie. I'll look at the when he talks about what happened during Maidan protests, he interviews the chief of police, which is just, again, just kind of hilarious. But what I'll do is in a previous video that I did on the Azov Battalion, I talked about this, and there's a research paper that was written using Google Earth images to give some estimates about the crowd size and exactly who was in that crowd. So we'll revisit that. Russian social media influence, because again, when Stone is critiquing so-called, I guess, whatever, we'll say Western social media influence, he just totally leaves out the huge, expansive, I mean, it's funny that he doesn't really talk about Russia at all. So yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that Russia is known for, and they're good at it. So whatever. So we'll look at that a little bit. We'll look at the Nuland call because that was something that was discussed, and kind of explain what that was. We'll look at the text without any narrative around it, and the fallout from the text. We'll look at the sacred victim. I'm calling it slander. Maybe that's my subjectivity, but this was, I think, the point in the film where it gets egregious. It's just really, to me, it was really bad. Essentially, long story short, to build this conspiracy theory about, just to build the conspiracy theory, Oliver Stone attempts to claim that people either committed knowing acts of self-harm, or people surrounding them committed acts of violence against them in the name of promoting their cause. And not only is it, I mean, it just doesn't make sense. I mean, one of the examples, the president that ran in 2004 in Ukraine almost died. It's just, it doesn't make sense. But anyway, so we'll look at that. We'll look at the Crimean referendum. He doesn't talk about what it was and what the options were. So that's interesting, because the options were extremely limited. And then we're going to talk about the Tatar representation in the area too. They're an ethnic minority, and they boycotted the referendum. So that, of course, skewed results too. It probably wouldn't have mattered, but so we'll look at that and some other things surrounding the very flawed Crimean referendum, the Malaysian Airlines Flight 17. This is when it gets, it looked like they were trying to wrap up the movie. I don't know, like maybe they had spent their budget, and at this point they didn't really have much else to invest, because it's really quick, it's at the end, and they attempt to tie events that occurred under the Reagan administration to this. And it's just, not to attack Stone. I'm not going to attack him personally. I think this movie is propaganda, but I think it's presented as a documentary, which is false. But I do think that maybe this is generational with Stone and his references. Trying to connect it how he did is a little far-fetched, to say the least. But also we'll dive into there was a Dutch inquiry and people named, and we'll look into some of those names. One of those names appears in another video that I have about Russian right-wing extremism and his role in the annexation of Crimea and the regional political apparatus that sprung up with the volunteer separatist forces in Donbass, and his connections to some of the extremist organizations. I'm thinking of Russian imperialist movements, Russia Unity, some of these far-right ultra-nationalist Nazi groups from Russia that were sent into Donbass to destabilize it prior to Russian troops on the ground. So we'll look at him a little bit, and then I'll wrap it up with a conclusion. Again, just running through this so that you all have something to look forward to, maybe some stuff that you could look into if you're interested in this topic. It's a lot. I'm going to try to keep it to like an hour. I know my last video was multiple hours. I think that was maybe something I just wanted to do for my own sake, but I think that topic too lends itself to people that really want to get into stuff like primary document reading. There's large sections of that where I'm reading directly from PDFs of stuff from like 1930, and this won't be that. I'm going to try to, even though it's a lot of information, keep it rolling. At least keep it to under an hour and a half. Yeah, so I do have some other things happening right now with other obligations. It's going to be at least a week before anything is out. I would honestly say 2 weeks, but I'll try my best, so we'll shoot for a week. I don't know because there's a lot happening, but in 2 weeks, there should be a new video out. And if something comes up, I will definitely update the channel. But again, just an update. It's been quiet, reasonably so, as the last video was 4 hours long, and that was quite an undertaking. Also, another thing before I jump, I've in the meanwhile, after taking a little bit of downtime from researching the previous video, and before starting this, I created a few TikTok videos, and those have done really well. One of them has over 12,000 views. So that's something else that's kind of the complete opposite of this, in which instead of doing deep dives, doing 60-second videos. And I have some YouTube shorts on here. Right now, they're mostly relegated to right-wing domestic terrorists that I just feel like people in America should know about and probably don't. But maybe in the future, I'll start applying it to these videos. Again, this topic, this region of the world is extremely complicated, and it's very old, and there's a lot to it. So there's a lot of history. So it doesn't necessarily lend itself to 60 seconds, but we'll see. Maybe down the road, that's something that I can accommodate. So that's it for now. Thanks for all the interaction. Thanks for subscribing, and especially thanks to the kind words. Some of you all DM me on Twitter or leave comments here. I really appreciate it, of course, from anybody, but it's always especially nice when I hear from folks that say they used to live in Ukraine or are from Eastern Europe, and they really appreciate these deep dives and an honest critique or an honest pushback on some of these false narratives that exist.